Good thing I waited 33 years to bench press, because otherwise I might have done it wrong.
Hey, it's Evan Carmichael, and like Andrew Huberman says,
for any of us, success in any endeavor is very closely related to how much focus we can bring to that endeavor.
So let's help you bring more focus to your endeavor with Andrew Huberman and my take on his top 10 rules for success.
I'm gonna go now. So thanks so much. I really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Need motivation?
Watch a top 10 with Believe Nation.
Okay, let's kick it off with rule number 1, focus.
For any of us, success in any endeavor is very closely related to how much focus we can bring to that endeavor. And the reward system, you start to realize, is entirely internal. No one's coming along and cramming dopamine in your ear or dripping it in your brain. It's all internal. And this starts to bring us into the kind of like discussion around mindsets. Because so my colleague Carol Dweck, who popularized this theme, growth mindset, it's, again, a very misunderstood concept. It's the idea that we can change, so that's built into that. But the discovery of growth mindset was of these kids that actually really enjoyed doing problem sets that they knew they couldn't get right. But for them, they would get this like dopamine release from just focusing on the problem. They liked doing puzzles they couldn't get right. It sounds crazy, but inevitably those kids are very good at puzzles and very good at math and these kinds of things. So growth mindset is, I believe, if it's sort of a neuroscience lens on growth mindset, would be that the agitation and stress that you feel at the beginning of something and when you're trying to lean into it and you can't focus is just a recognized gate. You have to pass that through that gate to get to the focus component. And then if you can reward the effort process, you really start to feel joy and low levels of excitement in the effort process. That's that buffering of adrenaline. That's that feeling like, yes, I've got a lot of adrenaline in my system, but I'm on the right path. It feels good to walk up this hill, so to speak. And when you start to bring those neural circuits together, you really start to create a whole set of circuits that are designed to be exported to any behavior you want. So if it's writing a book, great. If it's podcasting, great. If it's building a business, great. If it's building a terrific relationship, great. Then the circuits that Mother Nature has designed are incredibly generic so that we could adapt to whatever it is that we need to do. And I think the misunderstanding around how these circuits work has led to this idea that there's some secret entry point, maybe marked flow on the door, and there's a trampoline up to that door, and you just open that door and you're gonna be in it.
Right.
And nothing could be further from the truth. And anyone who's done well in any career or athletic pursuit knows this, but unfortunately, there's a kind of obsession with the idea that it's all supposed to feel good. And it does feel good, but there's a whole staircase in which it feels kind of lousy.
Rule number 2, replace negative thoughts.
I'm never going to argue that we can subjectively control all of our experience, because there's some things that just genuinely suck, right? And it's important to register those not so great events or terrible events, because they can drive us also. We can be driven from a place of anger, frustration, and revenge, or we can be driven from a place of love, gratitude, and et cetera. I'm not here to judge which one is better or worse, but the nervous system doesn't distinguish between them. So if you're the kind of person that needs to kind of budge yourself into something, great. If you're the kind of person that wants to do things from more of a warm, fuzzy feeling, that's fine too. What I will say is this: the ability to tap into this dopamine reward system, which is activated anytime you're in pursuit of something that's outside the boundaries of your skin and literally the boundaries of your body, as well as the reward system, the serotonin oxytocin system, which is really about the things that are contained within your own body and immediate experience, things like gratitude and touch and comfort and things like that with loved ones. The ability to tap into both is crucial. Now, you said something really important, which was, negative thoughts. What to do? I don't believe that it's very easy to suppress negative thoughts. However, when you realize that thoughts can be deliberately introduced, you can start replacing negative thoughts with new types of thoughts. So you can always add something in. But when people start to realize that thoughts are very much like physical actions of reaching and picking up a glass of water, or taking a jog around the block, or typing an email perfectly. This is something I sometimes do because I struggle to do the perfect email. Not all my emails are perfect, but when I do one, I make sure that I complete it and I think, okay, it's possible. It's not because the email being perfect is so important. It's because I want to remind myself that my thoughts and my actions are essentially the same. The nervous system can organize thoughts. So for somebody that's struggling, we have these examples like, oh, they were really back on their heels, or they were so depleted, no money and all this stuff. What are they going to, we have so many examples like that, but in trying to make it actionable, it's really about saying, yep, that's all true. But I'm going to introduce a thought, which is, I made it through today. I made it through today, and that's actually worth celebrating at a micro level. So if you can give yourself dopamine rewards in small increments, right? You're not trying to celebrate that you made it through one day. Sometimes that's a huge feat, but most of the time, you just want to dose yourself with a little bit of that internal release of dopamine. You start rewarding incremental steps. And if there's anything that your listeners could take away from this whole thing about dopamine and reward schedules and being in movement, it's reward incremental steps, in particular, incremental steps that are about forward action. So maybe that's writing an email. Maybe that's that run around the block. Maybe that's something much grander for you. As you get better at things, right, the stairs get further and further away from one another because you've achieved more success. And so they tend to be, you have to take the rungs on the ladder further apart, so to speak. That's a time when you really need to implement not only the dopamine rewards, but also those serotonin and oxytocin rewards, et cetera. So to make it actionable, I would say, remember, don't spend so much time trying to suppress negative thoughts. If you need trauma therapy, pursue that with a professional. But if you have negative thoughts, just remember, I can also introduce positive thoughts. The same way I can control running around the block. Positive thoughts are the equivalent of forward physical action. And if you reward them internally, you buffer yourself against the quitting circuit, this norepinephrine circuit we were talking about before. You are building a stronger version of yourself completely between your own ears. And some people say, well, that's silly. It's like you're saying, oh, I'm going to jump up and down, reward myself for doing nothing. No, you're building the neural circuits that you can control self-reward. And in doing that, you can push through days and weeks of effort consistently. I don't mean necessarily all-nighters, but you can push and push and push.
Rule number 3, reward the progress.
Growth mindset, which is the academic discovery and laboratory discovery of my colleague Carol Dweck at Stanford, is the hallmark of growth mindset is really two things. One is, I'm not where I want to be now, but I'm capable of getting there eventually. The other is to attach a sense of reward to the effort process itself. In fact,
don't reward the result, reward the effort.
That's right. And if you look at true high performers, people that are consistently good at what they do, they don't peak and go through the postpartum depression and crash and come back, and their life is a cycle of ups and downs, but really people who are on that upward trajectory consistently, those people attach dopamine to the effort process. And actually, one of her original studies on the discovery of growth mindset was these kids that loved doing math problems that they knew they couldn't get right. So it's like the people love puzzles, but in this case, they knew they couldn't get it right, but they loved doing it. And incidentally or not so incidentally, these kids are fantastic at math when there is a right answer, because they feel some sense of reward from the effort process.
Yeah.
Now, the cool thing about dopamine is that it's very subjectively controlled. We can all learn to secrete dopamine in our brain in response to things that are in a purely subjective way.
Our interpretation.
But it has to be attached to reality. So, one should never confuse
what is real.
Right. So if you're thinking about the effort you're expending. So let's say somebody right now is financially back on their heels and they're setting up a new business, for instance, and it's hard. If they can take a few moments or minutes each day to reflect on the fact that the effort process is allowing them to climb out of their hole potentially, that it's giving them an opportunity, that it's somehow they are on the right path, or if they're not in movement along that path, or at least oriented on the right path, they're not lying in bed all day.
They're taking a step forward.
They're taking a step. If they can reward that process internally, two things happen. First of all, the brain circuits that are associated with building subjective rewards and dopamine get stronger, so you get better at that process. And second, and most importantly, dopamine has an amazing ability to buffer adrenaline and buffer epinephrine. And what I mean by that is there was a study that was published in the journal Cell, excellent journal, Cell Press Journal, a couple years ago, showing that with repeated bouts of effort, we use and we release more and more epinephrine. It's kind of adrenaline, but in the brain.
With more effort, we
every time.
this.
Every time you put in effort. So every time you make, for this, let's keep it, if I were to keep it in the business context, every time you write that email, every time you, let's say it's a person who's a craftsman or a craftswoman, every time you're working in the shop and doing that, every bit of effort, you're taking a little bit of money out of this epinephrine account. You're spending epinephrine. At some point, those levels of epinephrine get high enough that you feel like quitting. It feels exhausting. And this was done in a beautiful study, actually, where they control the visual environments and they have the subjects exert effort. And they can control the visual environment. So sometimes the effort of taking steps and moving forward, this is actually kind of pushing forward and kind of swimming motion, would give them the sensation that they were actually making progress. And other times it was an exercise in futility where they would just keep the visual world stationary and they would expend effort and they didn't think they were going anywhere.
My gosh.
Epinephrine's climbing, and eventually they quit. Now dopamine is able to push back on that epinephrine and give you, anyone, the feeling that you could continue, and maybe even the feeling that you want to continue. And you've seen this actually, like football is a good example. Two teams play, say the Super Bowl. Both teams are max effort the entire time.
Yeah.
Max effort. The team that wins suddenly, in a moment, has the energy to jump all over the place, party for days. They can talk. I mean, they have
exhausted
energy.
right before
That's right.
then.
Well, that wasn't glycogen or stored energy of any kind, except it was neural energy. And what happened was, effort is this adrenaline. Eventually, people quit. They just quit. The dopamine is able to suppress that. And so then you're expending effort, but you're doing it from a place of feeling like you have energy for it.
Rule number 4, detach from external rewards.
There was a paper published that essentially was asking why any human or animal quits at any behavior. Now, certain behaviors, like I can't lift a car, unless it's a very small car. I can't lift a car. But if we're talking about running, or we're talking about long bouts of work, the question is, why do we quit? Like, what is that? And it turns out that every time we exert effort, a certain amount of noradrenaline in the brain is released. And there's a sort of a counter in the brainstem. And at some point, enough noradrenaline is released and it shuts down cognitive control, deliberate control over the motor circuitry, and we quit. That's it. But the thing that can restore those levels, or can sort of reset those levels lower and give us more gas, more mileage, is dopamine. And it makes perfect sense because our species had to move against very challenging things in nature and in terms of in culture at every stage of our evolution, including now. 2020 is a good example of this. And when a good example would be, if you're really slogging it out and things are miserable, just think like the worst family vacation, everything's a disaster, or a very hard physical event, and someone cracks a joke, you almost immediately feel a sense of relief. You see this in the team that wins the Super Bowl. Both teams slogged it out. You have to believe they were both at max effort the entire game. Look at the team that wins. They have extra energy. They're jumping all over the place. So it can't be physical energy. It can't be glycogen related. It's not ketone related. It's nothing in the body in that sense. It's dopamine's ability to take that level of norepinephrine and smack it back down. And so we can learn this, right? I mean, I think this is where there's real power, like in your story, or the story that I'm familiar with from your book, like the ability to push through those pain points is something that we really can export to other aspects of life, because it's the same neurochemicals that are involved. So when you get to a particular location, or maybe I recall, a portion where you're feeling lousy, you're injured or you feel like you're hurt, and you can reframe it mentally and think, I'm actually still on the ladder. I'm still holding on to a rung. I know at least that much. I'm still breathing. I know that much. And the lift that we get is not some psychological pump up. It's a neurochemical thing. It's dopamine suppressing norepinephrine and saying, you're on the right path. You can keep going. It's a permission to keep going. And we grant that permission to ourselves. No one grants that permission to us. I think one of the other kind of misconceptions that we want to dissolve is this idea that external rewards can actually propel us down long paths of success and high performance. They can't.
No, that's
internal
an unsustainable
rewards.
Fuel source.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a friend from the SEAL teams, and somebody asked us recently, we were given a talk, and somebody said, how can I make sure that I continue to self-reward and I'm not driven by these external rewards? How can I continue to have that drive? And his answer was very good. He said, give away all the external rewards. Now not everyone can afford to do that.
And it's just about you and you.
It's just you and you. And the more attached, there's a famous Stanford study done at Bing Nursery School, probably not far from where you were in the dormitory. There's a little nursery school in Escondido Village. And they did this study where they looked at kids that liked to playing during their recess. It's all recess in nursery school, but they're drawing. And they took the kids that really like to draw, and they started giving them little gold stars on their drawings. And then they like the gold stars for a kid, that's an extrinsic reward. And then they stopped doing that, and the kids stopped drawing. They just, they associated the good feeling of doing it with the external rewards. We have to be very cautious about how much of our internal dopamine we attach to external rewards if we want to continue to grow and pursue and focus and work hard. If you just want to get to some place and cash in, then fine. But most people find themselves in a pretty miserable place because their dopamine was so attached to external rewards, they need more and more of that.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there. Rule number 5, try hypnosis.
When people think of hypnosis, I think they think of stage hypnosis. What's the real deal? Why is it useful? And how do people actually use it?
Yeah. So I'm really glad you asked about this. So I have a colleague, his name is David Spiegel in our Department of Psychiatry at Stanford, and he and I have a collaboration going now looking at how respiration or breathing can be used to shift the brain into different states. And I've talked to David about this, and so I'm sort of borrowing from his words here, so I want to be fair that these are from those conversations. So hypnosis inevitably involves relaxing the nervous system, taking the nervous system into states that are more like sleep. Now, what I mean by that is in high alert states where you're talking and planning and in action and stress in particular, the brain is very linear. It's saying, okay, if this, then this, if then that. This is why we tend to be forward thinking when we're stressed. We tend to be not in our immediate experience, but really kind of forward thinking. So clinical hypnosis involves going into a state of deeper relaxation so that our analysis of space and time, meaning the way that the brain is perceiving events, is slightly dismantled so that it's a little bit dreamlike. And then the hypnotist, and this could be by listening to a script or listening to a hypnotherapist, starts to narrow our context, take our thoughts, if you will, down a particular path. And that path could be one of stress reduction or smoking cessation. Hypnosis incidentally is very good for treatment of smoking cessation or for feelings of well-being or confronting traumas. So what it is it's really opening up the window for neural plasticity, which is, of course, the brain's ability to change in response to experience. To trigger neural plasticity, you have to have focus, especially as an adult. You need acetylcholine released, but high levels of attention, acetylcholine and norepinephrine together. Norepinephrine to create that sense of urgency, and acetylcholine to bring that spotlight of focus in really, really tight. That triggers plasticity. But it marks certain synapses in the brain for change. But the actual changes in the synapses, the rewiring, okay, that happens during states of sleep and deep rest. So this is why when you're trying to learn a motor skill, you go and your tennis serve, it's not happening. You take a break, you come back, and you nail it. You're like, wait, what happened? Well, you needed time to set those circuits in motion and allow them to do the rewiring, the sort of adaptation. Hypnosis seems to capture both the high attentional state and the deep relaxation at the same time. It's this very unusual state of mind where you're neither asleep nor awake and in tight focus or narrow focus. And it's very clear that it leads to these rapid changes in behavior because you're rewiring the brain. And the reason you're able to rewire the brain so quickly is because you're getting the trigger event, the focus, and you're also getting the relaxation event simultaneously. And so it's much faster than separating out the learning trigger from the actual rewiring of the brain.
Rule number 6, practice releasing dopamine.
Dopamine is not just about reward. It's one of the biggest misconceptions. Dopamine is about motivation and drive. It's like a jet that propels you along a path.
How do we get more dopamine?
You practice subjectively releasing dopamine in your mind.
Like how?
Okay, so that's a great question. First of all, there are ways you can get more dopamine release through thoughts or through drugs or through supplements. I want to be really clear. There is a drug, there are 2 drugs actually, that will cause massive release of dopamine. They're called cocaine and methamphetamine. The problem
That's what gets us addicted because it feels so good.
The problem is, cocaine and methamphetamine stimulate so much dopamine release that the drug becomes the only source. It becomes the goal and the path. It becomes the path and the destination. And you look at people's lives when they do a lot of cocaine and methamphetamine, and that baseline on their life goes down. Dopamine is this incredibly powerful molecule that allows us to buffer the effort process. It allows us to be in effort longer, and it allows us to actually eventually enjoy the process of effort.
And not think about the reward, but just say, oh, I'm enjoying the process.
Right. Well, you just described the first step. The first step in learning to attach dopamine to the effort process, which is the key operation in order to succeed, is to be very careful about how much you focus on the end goal. Keeping the goal in mind is important for like a proper orientation. You have to know the ultimate destination. But if at any point we were to evaluate our progress relative to that end goal, or if we don't know what the end goal is, there's a huge gap there, and it can feel overwhelming. The key to this is, if we want to be very concrete, we should probably focus on actions. And I'll use fitness as an example because it translates to everybody, whereas people's circumstances differ. Let's say somebody really wants to take on a fitness routine. They hate running, or they want to lose weight in a healthy way, this kind of thing. So we've all heard the example, well, you put your shoes by the door on day 1. Day 2, you put them on. Day 3, you go out the door. Day 4, you walk around the block, and then, and then eventually like they're running marathons. Okay, great. But to sustain that behavior, or even to make the behavior pleasurable and to give you energy, the key is to subjectively reward those steps. So it's not going to be, let's say I go out and I run a mile, and my goal is to run 10 miles in a few weeks. The key is, as you're in the strain of that mile, the hard part, you want to tell yourself, this is the good part. This is the part that gives me energy. And I'll be very surprised if people don't actually feel like they could continue further. So it's a journey of 1,000 miles starts with is made up of single steps. But the key is to reward the harder steps, not the easier ones, and not the ones where you get the thing that you want. There's a process I'm going through right now where I'm trying to write a book, and it's hard. And I was told that the harder it is, the better I'm probably doing it. And I was like, great. And my editor's ready to kill me, and because I'm slow, and I know, and I'm a very slow person. I drive people crazy. I'm like glacially slow because science is slow, and I like to get things right.
You want to rush it. Yeah.
I like to get things right, but I'm very proud of the fact that everything we've published, I can stand behind. It was the best we could do with the tools at the time, and I just know that when I look back on a writing career or a scientific career, I want to be able to say, every journal we put it in was rock solid. Everything was rock solid. We had fun doing it. The relationship. So I go slow.
Yeah.
But as a consequence, what I'm finding is there are a lot of interferences these days. I think social media is great. I teach neuroscience on social media because I think it's important to do public education.
But it's a distraction too.
But it's incredible. And it's incredible how much time and energy it can take. So what I've started doing now is I turn off my phone and I lock it in a safe. And I experience extreme anxiety.
Right?
It's so weird.
Why is that? Is it because it gives you so much dopamine that when you're not having it?
Well, this is scary because I actually think, brief anecdote, on the weekend I was driving, there's a kid that I mentor, and I picked up my phone and I was texting while I was driving. And he said to me, this is really embarrassing for me, he said, I wish you wouldn't text while you drive. And I put it down and I realized, this is crazy. I know that my life and his life is far more important, and the lives of the people around me are far more important than any text message, which means I wasn't doing it rationally. It's just pure reflex at this point. So I don't think I pick up the phone because I don't even know what I'm looking for there anymore. It's just become reflexive.
Wow.
So for me lately, the longer I can keep that phone in a safe and write on a grant or this book, what I tell myself is the agitation is good. At least I'm not doing that. And then I find that as I start to write and I get into the process, I start feeling good about it, and I'll pause and say, okay, I have control. I have ultimate control over my behavior. I can put that thing away. There might be a nuclear war out there, and I'm just doing this anyway. I have control over my thoughts, my feelings, and behavior. So I tell myself that, and then I find I have immense energy, and all I want to do is write. And I kind of tunnel into the process.
Wow.
And I think that sometimes people need to write these things out for themselves so it's really concrete. I think some people are so unskilled at subjective rewards that writing it out is really powerful.
So what would you write out for yourself as a subjective reward for this experience?
As long as I'm writing, I'm on the right path. As long as I'm not writing, I'm looking at my phone, I'm not on the right path. Because for me, the 2 or 3 things that are most important for my career are writing grants, working on this book manuscript, and writing scientific manuscripts. I mean, there are other things as well.
And anything else that you're not doing is holding you back from doing that.
That's right.
So you need to be focused, center mass forward on doing those things.
That's right. So I don't do any jumping around, power poses, things like that. I will use tools to kind of ramp up my dopamine. There are certain songs that are really embedded in my emotional thing that go back to, when I was a, wild, skateboarding punk rock teenager that will get me fired up. And I think there's real utility. That's pure dopamine.
Rule number 7, think in processes.
Hashtag growth mindset is one of the most popular hashtags in social media, but most people don't actually know what it means. And again, this is Carol Dweck's discovery, not mine. It was discovered in a group of kids that were doing math problems or other kinds of puzzles that they knew they couldn't get right, but they enjoyed doing them, and they perform exceedingly well on lots of sorts of tests of that sort, when there is the right answer, of course. And so what they do is they're wired for effort. They're wired for the puzzle, not for the solution. And when I say puzzle, I don't mean the noun puzzle. I mean the verb for being puzzled. It, for them, feels good. And so we need to think, if we're talking about the nervous system and we want to make it actionable for high performance, whether or not it's in business or sport or otherwise, we want to think in terms of processes, not events, and verbs, not nouns. So growth mindset as a verb, as an action item, reward as a verb, not just as you're going to just pat yourself on the back. It's what you internalize. It's a process. That's how the neural circuits that underlie reward get stronger. And the beauty of the brain is that you have this thing of neuroplasticity, which is its ability to change itself throughout the whole lifespan. And the more you practice this, the better you get at it. And it does not mean you're walking around talking delusionally about how great life is when everything is terrible. It means you might even be very stoic. You might be, hopefully you're very rational, but you have the energy to continue to push forward.
Rule number 8, attach meaning.
There's an interesting process that occurs when people start to realize that rewards are all internal. And what they start to do is they start linking this duration path outcome thing to their internal rewards. And so, to put this simply, one of the most powerful things that any person can do is to learn to control this idea of duration, path, and outcome, and attach an internal sense of reward, just that you're doing well. To reward yourself mentally, just say, I'm doing well, I'm actually on the right path. To do that inside of the demands that come from the external world, the more often that we can self-reward some aspect of the process, provided it's in the right direction of what we're trying to achieve, the more energy we're going to have for that, the more focus we're going to have for that. And remember, the reason I say energy, I don't throw that around loosely, is that limiting amount of noradrenaline is constantly being kept at bay. You're literally buffering the quit response. And so when people start realizing that if they set the goals inside of the larger goal and self-reward each one of those, they essentially have an infinite amount of energy to pursue those goals. They have an infinite amount of focus to pursue those goals. You see this most in the special operations community and people that are selected essentially for this process. So one of the things that's been intriguing to me, I have some friends from the SEAL teams, and I don't begin to really understand the real work that they do deployed because I've never done that kind of work. But I've always been intrigued by the selection process, the so-called BUDS process, right? Because carrying logs and getting in cold water and all that, that's not really how the work is. That's really not what the work is about. So the selection process is interesting because everyone shows up fit, motivated, and convinced that they're not going to quit. I mean, I think there might be a couple people that just show up, but everybody is absolutely convinced. And then a very small subset of them make it through. And I'd be willing to bet that the ones that make it through, of course, they're gritty and resilient, but they all are essentially, right? So that's necessary but not sufficient, obviously. Otherwise, everyone would make it through. The people that make it through somehow are able to tap into a process. Maybe it's a reward process. Maybe it's through self-punishment. Maybe it's through self-reward in the positive sense. But they're able to control something inside an environment that is not controlled by them. It's controlled by the instructors. And I've always been struck by the fact that in order to get through, you just have to not quit. Remember, people aren't being deselected. They're not saying, get out of here, you're not good enough. People are deciding that for themselves. Right. And so it's interesting because it brings about a real world experiment of people who are quitting. And I believe they're quitting because they can't manage these neurotransmitters. And when I say manage, I think that the people that get through, knowing some of these people quite well, had an internal process by which they could reward themselves for doing something that might have just looked trivial to everybody else, but it gave them more gas, more energy. Right? And what's interesting is the process, the kind of unconscious genius of the BUDS process is that they've picked two sensory events that are across the board challenging for everybody. One is cold water, which is great because most of the time it can't kill you, right? It's not like heat, which can kill you. It's cold water and sleep deprivation. And so the ability to do these, like what I'm calling DPOs, this duration, path, and outcome steps and procedures, is great on when you're rested. When you're well fed, well slept, you can do anything. You can be in any hard conversation. You can work through anything. So what they do is they start taking the autonomic nervous system, which is these deep reserves of the nervous system, that when our autonomic nervous system is off, it starts making us pay more attention to how we feel than the demands of the world around us. Remember that basic challenge in the nervous system. And so sleep deprivation is the best way that you can pull somebody down from their ability to analyze duration, path, and outcome and reward themselves. Sleep deprivation is the way in which you essentially pull apart the nervous system and the way that it wants to function, because it's very easy, again, rested, to do all this. But so what they do is they're sleep deprived people, they put them in cold water. They're trying to get them more in touch with the way that they feel inside than what they need to do in response to the external demands. Right. And everyone I know that's made it through that process did it slightly differently, but I'll tell you how they didn't do it. They didn't do it through sheer grit and determination. They did it through attaching a sense of meaning. They did it by micro slicing the day, or slicing the day into a series of meals that they just needed to get to, and then rewarding themselves for getting to that next milestone. So they don't know, most of them, probably had very low concept of dopamine and norepinephrine, but that's the process. That's also the process, I think, that allows someone to finish an ultra. I've never run an ultra, but I think that process of self-reward is grit and resilience in a kind of neurochemical definition. Yeah. And I think it's the thing that anybody can tap into. And I think it's so key, because I think people think that it's just so key that people understand, that these circuits are not unique to people who run ultras or people that make it through, stringent filter, special operations command. It's the same thing that
it is interesting. Yeah. Rule number 9, learn breathing patterns.
I'm really glad you mentioned the diaphragm. Diaphragm, of course, being this muscle inside of all of us, at least all mammals, that works all the time to move our lungs, because all the cells in our body need oxygen. Of course, we got to get rid of carbon dioxide. It does that, but it's done reflexively, but we can also take voluntary control over it. I want to just mention about the diaphragm, why it's so important for these state changes, is that a lot of people talk about the vagus nerve and all this stuff. The vagus and these connections between the brain and this vagus nerve or the gut, it's what gets activated when you're really full and you eat a big meal and you feel relaxed. Those are great, but it's very slow. The diaphragm is skeletal muscle, just like your bicep, just like your tricep, just like your quadricep. It is the only internal organ, except maybe a couple muscles in your throat, that are actually skeletal muscle, meaning it was designed to be voluntarily moved. And the diaphragm isn't just designed to move your lungs, it also sends a signal through the so-called phrenic nerve back to the brain to inform your brain about the status of your body. So when you breathe fast deliberately, the reason you feel kind of an elevated sense of alertness is because Yeah, there are chemicals secreted, but mostly because the phrenic nerve is firing off. It's telling you, hey, the body's moving. We're really running now, even though you're stationary in a chair if you're doing breathing. Or if you're breathing very slowly and rhythmically, right? Box type breathing or, slow breathing. Your diaphragm is telling your brain, hey, we're calm, we're good. And you calm down very quickly on the order of seconds. And so once you start tapping into this, you start realizing, okay, movement of the body was designed to inform the brain of where to be, not just the brain telling the body. And how does the body communicate with the brain? Through the phrenic nerve from the diaphragm. So my lab is really pursuing two questions, and this is still being worked out. So I just want to highlight that it's still in progress. But certain patterns of breathing will calm you very much like entering a hypnotic state. And so you have a subset of neurons in your brainstem that are responsible for sighing. You have a subset of neurons in your brainstem responsible for coughing, subset of neurons responsible for laughter, and a subset of neurons in your brainstem for sighing. This was a paper published in Nature. This is a real thing. These neurons are every so often, and your dog does this too, you inhale twice, and then you exhale long. Now that double inhale, best done through the nose on the inhales, and then long exhale through the mouth, activates these sigh neurons that trigger the so-called calming reflex, the parasympathetic arm of the nervous system. So we have a hardwired mechanism, a set of neurons, connection to the diaphragm, and back again from the diaphragm to the brain that was designed to activate calm. And when people ask me, how should I breathe to calm myself down? I always say double inhale through the nose followed by exhales. 2 or 3 of those will reset your autonomic nervous system faster than any other mechanism we're aware of, because it's really capitalizing on a set of neural circuits. Now, once you're calm, you say, well, how do I get into plasticity states? There you want to go the other direction. That's going to be inhaling a lot more than you exhale. You're going to be driving in more oxygen than you are breathing out, generally carbon dioxide. And that will lead to states that are kind of more elevated. This is typical of things like Tumo breathing, Wim Hof breathing, Kundalini breathing. And when people enter those states, their whole world changes because it shuts off the frontal cortex. This is why sometimes people pass out or they feel like they want to get up and move. You get some odd behavior when you're doing this kind of thing. So the key is, if you want to access states of heightened plasticity, let's say you want to learn faster, or you want to be more, you want to bring more out of some physical training that you're doing. The key is to apply those principles. First, you need to focus. You need to bring yourself to that heightened state of alertness. You can breathe to do that. So this would be super oxygenated breathing. Then you want to drop into a state of calm. And you do that by a couple, maybe 2 or 3 rounds of inhale, inhale, exhale, inhale, inhale, exhale. And then now your brain is in a state, we believe, this is still again being worked out in labs like mine and David's, that then you're in a state for heightened learning, because you're in a state where neurochemicals like acetylcholine are going to be at levels that are higher than they typically would be. Things like noradrenaline, slightly higher than they typically would be, but not in a discombobulated way, in a very regulated way. And the cool thing is you're regulating them. So you could argue, earlier we were talking about subjective emotions and thoughts and all these things, but one thing that's absolutely concrete is breathing. I always think of physical exercise, movement, writing, whatever, singing, dancing, talking. Those are physical actions in the universe. Then you have thoughts, and somewhere in between those is controlling your respiration. Once you can control everything that's within the confines of your skull and skin, once you can really control that relationship, that brain-body relationship, you start to realize that relationship is a lot like any other relationship to forward action. It's just all happening within the confines of my body. So it's heightened states of focus followed by states of relaxation that are going to prime your nervous system for learning and plasticity, just like hypnosis.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is be deliberate.
If I finish a chapter, I will stop for a moment and I'll just kind of smile and laugh at myself. I'm big on self-reflection with humor and just think that this is crazy. My brain is under my control. There would be people out there that say there's no free will, but I do not believe that. I put my hands in a lot of brains. You stimulate certain brain areas, people do things. You stimulate other brain areas, people think things. Ultimately, unless you have electrodes in your head and someone's stimulating them, we are in control of our thoughts and behaviors. Wow. We can't control all of them, but my goal is to be as deliberate and non-reflexive as possible in life. That's my goal from when I wake up in the morning until I go to sleep.
How do we get to that place?
little by little and by rewarding each thing. If you get up and I'll use the make the bed example, make the bed, you're not back on your heels, you make a cup of coffee, you sit down, you script out something in a journal, you exercise, maybe you call a relative that you think you need to hear from you or that you'd like to talk to. You do something in a deliberate way, just being deliberate and learning to push away the things that are trying to make you reflexive is so important.
There's a classic experiment in behavioral biology called the tube test, where you take two mice, you put them in a tube, and they try and push each other out. They fight for that tube. And one mouse inevitably pushes out the other mouse. The one that stays in the tube is the winner. The one that got pushed out is called the loser. What's interesting is that if you take those same mice and give them new competitors, the one that won has a much higher than chance probability of being a winner the subsequent battle. What's called a battle. The loser has a much higher probability of losing. Now that's the first experiment. And you go, okay, well, winners become winners, losers become losers. But it's actually far more interesting than that. Because if you take the loser and you put him against even a known winner and you push the loser from behind, the loser becomes the winner and the winner becomes the loser. And even if the effort that the loser that became the winner exerted wasn't their own, right? You've got a human pushing with a stick on this little mouse. So the important thing is the third experiment, which only arrived a few years ago. This is an experiment that was published in the journal Science. Science and Nature are our Super Bowl and NBA championships of science. Very 99% rejection rates, very stringent, thoroughly peer reviewed, not just any publications. A laboratory, not mine, unfortunately, did the experiment where they monitored the brains of these mice while they were engaging in this tube test battle. And they found that there was one brain area, it's a subregion of the prefrontal cortex, not the whole prefrontal cortex, that's more active in the winner and less active in the loser. So much so that if you chemically or electrically activate this brain area in the loser, that loser becomes the winner. If you quiet this brain area in the winner, or an animal that's about to win, it suddenly becomes the loser. So you say, what in the world is this brain area doing to the body and to the psychology of these mice? Now, we don't know the psychology of the mice, but they did do some important controls. And it's not testosterone. Although there's a testosterone increase associated with winning, it is not testosterone in the moment. It's not cortisol. It's not any of the other normal things that you might look to. It's not muscle strength. It turns out that stimulation of this brain area that causes winning is associated with increased anxiety, effort, and adrenaline. And all it does is it converts that anxiety into more steps forward per unit time. Literally just steps forward. So if you take this brain area and you quiet it for a given level of stress, the animal backs up a little bit more or pauses a little bit more. If you stimulate this brain area for the same amount of stress, the animal advances a little bit more as opposed to pauses or backs up. And the thing that's really key to take away from this for everyone's individual lives and goals is that if you really think about it, you always have only three options. You can either be stationary, you can back up, you can retreat, or you can go forward. And you want to move forward in an adaptive way. You don't want to walk off a cliff or do something stupid financially or physically, but anxiety and stress and what we call autonomic arousal were designed to move us. They create a sense of agitation and discomfort for a reason, but it wasn't just designed to move us to run and hide. It was also designed to move us forward. And a lot of people take the agitation, the fear, the anxiety about starting something new, and they try and work with that and push down on it. There's just so much in our culture that's about trying to get homeostasis, a word that I really despise, that homeostasis and trying to get back to this place of calm or flow so that they can move forward. And what they don't appreciate, or what people haven't been told because the science is very new, is that all forms of adaptive behavior in the animal kingdom and in humans, whether or not it's with the mind or the body or both, involve a fairly high level of stress and anxiety that was designed to move us forward. And it doesn't have to be just competition and battle. This could be writing your book. This could be finding the mate that you
that you want to find a life mate. It could be any number of different things that you're going to pursue. There's always anxiety associated with that. And trying to bypass that could actually represent the failure of our species. One of the reasons why breathing is such a powerful tool for shifting one's state is that it's always available for voluntary control. It's just right there. I can decide right now to do 3 inhales, or I can just go back to breathing reflexively. I can just do that at any moment. So the neural real estate, which is in the brainstem that controls breathing, is in a unique position because it's at the kind of boundary between conscious control and unconscious control. I can't do that for my digestion. I can't do that for most everything that happens internally. The other thing is that breathing controls our level of alertness very dramatically. So the faster you breathe, generally, the more alert you are. The slower you breathe, the more calm you're going to be.
The faster you breathe, meaning shorter, quick breaths, or
either way. So we're just to take a brief adventure through the neuroscience of breathing and how it relates to brain states. And there's some fun tools in here. So forgive me for this tangent, but you have 2 brain areas that are responsible for breathing. One is called, for the aficionados, the pre-Buttsinger complex. It was discovered by Jack Feldman at UCLA. It's named after a bottle of wine, so now people won't forget it. And it controls rhythmic breathing. So inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale. It's just rhythmic breathing. There's another brain area that controls breathing, which is near what's called the parafacial nucleus, which involves breathing anytime there are double inhales or double exhales or triple inhales. And you say, well, why would you have this second brain area for breathing? Well, it turns out when you're speaking or crying or coughing, you need to coordinate your breathing with your speaking. And that means sometimes you need to take multiple inhales or multiple exhales. And this is all happening very, very fast. You don't notice. But there's a very important discovery that was made a few years ago by Jack's lab and by a guy named Mark Krasno at Stanford, who discovered there's a set of neurons in your brainstem, my brainstem, everybody's brainstem, and every mammal's brainstem. It's a very small number of neurons that controls a specific pattern of breathing, which are called physiological sighs. So these are not just sighs where you go and exhale. These are sighs that involve doing 2 inhales and then an extended exhale.
We all do this.
You do this during sleep. Anytime carbon dioxide levels in your bloodstream get too high, in order to get more oxygen into your system. People also do this if they've been crying or sobbing. They'll do this and then they'll exhale. So what's happening with these physiological sighs and why is this powerful? So your lungs are 2 big bags of air, but they actually are made up of a ton of little sacs of air called the alveoli of the lungs. When we are exercising or when we are sleeping or anytime we're doing anything, these little sacs of air eventually start to collapse. And what happens is carbon dioxide builds up in our system and we experience that as stress. We actually feel the impulse to breathe because carbon dioxide levels get too high. There are neurons that sense carbon dioxide. And then without realizing it, you do a double inhale and then exhale. Typically the inhales are done through the nose and the exhale is done through the mouth. So it looks like... And why the second inhale? Well, if you've ever tried to blow up a balloon for a kid at a kid's party or just blown up a balloon, you sometimes blow into that empty balloon. It doesn't go anywhere. So what do? You do 2 you go, and then it pops open. So these double inhales pop open the alveoli of the lungs. They don't explode them, but they pop them open, which pulls carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream, brings oxygen, and then you offload carbon dioxide.
Incidentally, or not so incidentally, I should say, when you look at communities of very high performers, and I'm fortunate enough to do some consulting with some people from special forces communities and so forth, they're very good, as are you, at attaching a reward to specific behaviors in subjective ways. So growth mindset and these dopamine rewards that we subjectively apply are not about saying, oh, I had a terrible day, I performed poorly, but you know what, it's great, I just feel great anyway. It's not about that. It's not about attaching your sense of reward to the ultimate goal. It's about attaching your sense of reward to the fact that you're making action steps that are generally in the right direction. The more you can reward the effort process.
I didn't have the power of concentration. I hadn't read all the good books that gun high school students read growing up. I had to learn how to speak properly. I learned how to think properly and really learn how to commit to something that was very linear and at times was very painful. And I went to some pretty extreme things. I actually used to set a timer and I wouldn't allow myself to get out of the chair until the timer went off.
Right.
So, and I would experience extreme agitation. But over time, I got pretty good, and now I can do long stints of work without any breaks.
What's interesting about growth mindset is that it seems like there's some attachment of the reward systems of the brain to the action or the pursuit of a goal, not just achieving a goal. And when we step back and we look at what that really entails at a neurochemical level, we have reward systems in the brain. They generally fall into two categories. There are the reward systems that make you feel really good with kind of the here and now and everything that's within the confines of your skin and the things you already have, you know, love of your dog, love of your spouse, gratitude for all the things you happen to have. And those are generally governed by the release of molecules like serotonin and oxytocin. Okay. But then there's another reward system, which is the one that drove a lot of human evolution, which is the dopamine reward system. Now, dopamine is a very misunderstood molecule. It's often talked about only in the context of reward. Like, I'm going to work to this goal. I'm going to build my company. I'm going to, get tenure as a professor, whatever it is. And you reach it and you get this dopamine reward. And indeed, that's true. But what's often not discussed is that dopamine is secreted en route to rewards while you pursue rewards. Now, the ability to tap into that system, to subjectively amplify that pathway of reward in pursuit of goals, is an absolute game changer when it comes to things like anything challenging that of long duration or uncertainty or getting through this COVID, pandemic situation. But the amazing thing is, remember, the brain only does 5 things, and we get to decide which of those sensations and perceptions have relevance and which ones don't, or which ones are attached to a goal and which ones aren't. So growth mindset in its purest form is the attachment of these reward systems to the effort process, to the friction process, and not just to obtaining a reward. And just as a kind of final point to that, there's a very well-known body of literature in neuroscience, at least among neuroscientists, that talks about something called reward prediction error. And it says, if you can dose the dopamine subjectively as you go through the pursuit of something, and then have a lot of dopamine when you reach that thing, it's very likely that you're going to reinforce that circuit. There will be neural plasticity, and that circuit will become stronger. So the next time you will revisit those sets of behaviors. The opposite can happen too, where you're in real anticipation of something. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. And then you reach that goal and it's kind of underwhelming. And that generally triggers this circuit that I referred to earlier, this kind of disappointment or pro-depressive circuit. So dopamine is involved in reward, but it's also involved in the pursuit of rewards. And so as you reach a milestone, or as you tell yourself, I'm on the right track, this friction I'm feeling, this late night, this early morning, this hard conversation with somebody that doesn't feel good, I'm going to tell myself this is for a larger purpose. That's that subjective insertion, that abstraction that we were talking about earlier. And when you start releasing dopamine to those kinds of things, there's essentially no limit on the number of things you can do or the energy to do them. So just as a last point about dopamine, when we're in effort, we're always secreting adrenaline. We're always in pursuit, and it's draining. It's tiring. Dopamine has this beautiful capacity to buffer adrenaline. And you know this, you've experienced this before, because if you've ever been working really, really hard, maybe your team is depleted, everything's just a mess, and somebody cracks a joke, and all of a sudden, in an instant, it's like everything's reframed. That couldn't have been hormonal. Hormones work on the schedule of like hours to days to weeks. It had to be neurochemical. It absolutely had to be neurochemical, and that neurochemical is dopamine.
I would hide in the Tower Books section in the evenings, and I would read everything about fitness, psychology, anything I could. I've always devoured information. My favorite book when I was a kid was the Encyclopedia or the Guinness Book of World Records. So I would, like, when I was a little kid, I'd walk around the Aspen Center for Physics and I would tell anyone. I didn't even ask them if they wanted to hear about like what's the world's smallest eutherian mammal. I would it could tell you all these facts that were kind of meaningless at the time, but I've always been fascinated by the inventory of different animals on the planet and their different behaviors. And so voracious reader, and still now.
There is something called adrenal insufficiency syndrome, which is a real medical phenomenon where the adrenals are incapable of making these cortisol and adrenal hormones. But the truth is that you have enough adrenaline and cortisol in your body to last 2 lifetimes and 25 famines. I mean, we were built with a lot of robustness, right? This explains, the David Goggins of the world. We all do have that greater capacity that people talk about. The stress is very misunderstood because people think of stress as this ancient carryover that's very unfortunate. It kind of gets lumped with depression, like, oh, this is just a flaw in our design or something. But actually, stress is wonderful. It actually activates our immune system. So anytime you liberate adrenaline into your bloodstream, you also protect yourself against infection of bacteria and viruses. Because if you think about it, if we had to gather food and we didn't have it, and we had to then pack up and migrate long distances, you can't afford to get sick. And this is why people who work, and then rest, they usually get sick when they finally stop and rest. Really? Yeah, it's like the post-finals phenomenon in university, or after the season for a game, or the caretakers thing where you're taking care of somebody who's ill and you're just work, or taking care of young children, and then you finally stop to rest, you go on vacation and you get slammed with an illness.
Why is that? Because you're being in your comfort zone now? Or
it's because stress turned off. And adrenaline, so that the stress response recruits the immune organs of the body to release killer T cells. In fact, Wim Hof breathing, I know you're familiar with Wim, of doing 20 or 30 deep inhales and exhales, and also combined with some breath hold type work, exhale, hold, inhale, hold, is known to stimulate adrenaline release. And one of the better papers that's out there, scientific peer-reviewed papers, is a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences where they brought in two groups. One group did Wim Hof breathing. The other group did just mindful meditation. Both groups were injected with E. coli. Right?
It's crazy.
Right?
It's crazy.
It's crazy. The meditators got fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. And the people who did Wim Hof either didn't get it or got it to a much lesser extent.
They felt sluggish, but
That's
not.
Right. They didn't. Right.
Isn't that
This
crazy?
is not an experiment to do at home.
Isn't this crazy?
But it makes perfect sense because that breathing simulates a stress response. It stimulates cortisol and adrenaline, which signals
which protects the body.
Right, which signals to the thymus, the spleen, and the other, the nodes of the immune system to liberate killer cells. And so when that bacteria comes in, the system is ready for it.
Your body is defending against viruses and disease,
That's right.
essentially. When you create a routine of healthy stress.
That's right. And we could talk about, we definitely you don't want stress on all the time. Sleep is really important, et cetera. But that stress response combats infection because it recruits immune cells.
Why fear? Why do we have fears? Why do we have trauma? Why do we have shame? And here's the stinger. It was all set up for you in your youth. I don't want to focus on the bad, but most of this stuff when you're young, you're just a passive learning machine. It's all coming in. Little kids are learning 3 languages with no accents flexibly. They're not even thinking about it. They're learning instruments. Someone asked a great question the other day at the workshop. Wait, now I know I want all that stuff. How come it's so much tougher? And there's a lot of biology that I'd be happy to tell you about that explains why that all shuts down after these so-called critical periods during development. So what happens when you're an adult and you want to change your brain? So now I'm going to get into stuff that hopefully is useful to you. Okay, so these basic facts that changing your brain in a real way as an adult requires that you do particular things that activate particular chemical systems in your brain. So how do you do that, right? I could tell you all about the chemicals and I'll tell you a little bit about them, but how do you do it? Okay, so this is a right here, right now, urgent situation, car wreck. It's terrible. You could imagine any other trauma in its place. When that happens, a little area in the base of the brain, the name isn't important, but if you care, it's called nucleus basalis, does its job, which is just, it's an alert system. It puts all its attention on right here, right now, get everybody safe. It's your alert system. And it has this effect of dumping out a certain chemical called acetylcholine at specific locations in the brain that are paired with that experience. And forever, that experience will be traumatic unless something else is done. Okay? So there's some nuance and some details to this, but that pretty much summarizes it. It's been replicated many, many times in dozens of studies. You can pair pretty much any experience with stimulation of nucleus basalis, this thing in the base of the brain, and that experience will be mapped or remapped in your brain as an adult. And that's remarkable. It's also exciting because then someone like me says, well, then how do I change my experience? How do I change the meaning of what happens? How do I change something from traumatic to positive? The good news is nucleus basalis is just a slave to whatever is exciting, traumatic. It likes emotion. It likes peaks and lows. And so if acetylcholine is released, that means you can massively change your brain at that moment with whatever's paired with it. And so when you get into a peak state here and you're jumping up and down,
or in a really low state and you're thinking how miserable something is, you have to be really careful because those are the things that you're wiring in, all right? So you can move to a state like this about driving later if you form enough associations with driving to really eliminate, to override the fear. You need to create a positive experience in its place. So how do you do that? So I'm gonna tell you that the way to do that is not to think too hard and to not verbalize things too much. And this is coming from someone who spent 25 years, 3 times a week on a couch, letting subconscious things geyser up. And that's where I really learned that it was really the things that you don't realize that have the potential to have the most impact. But this power of emotion, the ability to couple really strong emotions with things, is so useful if you want to change your brain for the better. And the way you do that is clear in the physical space. We all know this story. There are many news cases like this. Woman's child stuck under car, superhuman strength. We heard a lot of amazing stories about desperation. JJ's story was one of desperation. She's like, no, I'm not going to accept failure, because failure in the case she was describing was potentially the death of her child. So desperation is a strong one, and it's motivated by fear. But what if you're not in a desperate state and you really want to do something? In that case, there's something remarkable. And then we should ask ourselves, why are children such great passive learners? They're not trying, they're just learning. They're coming home with all sorts of things, sometimes things you don't want them to come home with, right? It's because they have this element of play. And what is play? Play isn't just movement, although it includes movement. It's giving things everything you've got, but keeping it in perspective. It's that sweet spot of enjoying life and trying really, really hard at it at the same time. It's essentially what we all strive for. And there are these incredible cases throughout history. Famous scientists, because I grew up in a house where people, revered scientists like Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner. He's most famous for bongo drumming naked on the roof of Caltech. And he became an amazing artist in his 60s. And he developed all sorts of other skills. And he always had this childlike way of looking at the world. He never let himself get stuck in his ways. Never became a curmudgeon, and a remarkable man. And that's something that if you come away with nothing else, I encourage you to do that. You want your brain to change, stay light, stay loose, but give it everything you've got.
Can a person make it so they never get depressed? They never react to their perception, their people's actions towards them, where they never get to a state of, I don't feel good, I'm feeling more depressed, I'm in a dark place now, I'm stuck in this place. Is there a way that we could ever defend ourselves against negative stressors, negative emotions? Or do we need them as well to have contrast in life?
Well, there's sort of 2 views on this. I'll reveal mine after I explain the 2 views. One is that these states, I guess I'm automatically calling things like depression a state of mind and body. So when I say state of mind, I mean brain and body.
Because your body is really feeling. It's like the brain is connected to the body.
Right.
And so if you're saying internally the thought of like, I'm depressed, or I don't feel good, or I'm sad, or I'm lonely, or I'm not good enough, the body's going to react. Is that what I'm understanding?
Absolutely.
Like the body's going to manifest what the mind is telling you.
Absolutely.
The thought, the idea, you're going to be like, I'm sad, I'm not good enough, you're going to shrink.
Right.
Is that right?
That's right. I mean, there are really 2 forms of depression. Sometimes they're intermixed, but one is anxiety-associated depression. And you, if you've ever experienced it, or for anyone that's experienced it, they feel agitation in their body. And their mind races, but in their body. So the body is recruited. There are also depressive states that people feel very fatigued and exhausted. It's an overwhelm. And they also experience that in their body. The idea of getting out of bed in the morning is hard, motivating to exercise, doing the sorts of things that we know are powerful for pushing back on depression. Mm-hmm. So the body is recruited. I think most people would say that depressive states are bad when they bring down the baseline on life. As a brief aside, anytime there's a question about mental health or addiction or trauma or anything, one could look at it and make up some argument of, well, evolutionarily, this makes sense, we all get depressed, but we have to be fair to the person experiencing it, of course, and have sensitivity that some behaviors will keep the baseline of our life steady, meaning job, relationships, etc., will continue as they are. Other activities will tend to improve the baseline on our life. Job, activities, relationship, etc., will improve. And then there's some things like heroin, which does very quickly, we can predict that very quickly the baseline on life is going to creep down regardless of who that person is, right? So people say, can you get addicted to water? Well, maybe, but I have to drink a lot of water before the baseline of my life starts to go down.
So it just feels uncomfortable.
That's
it's
right.
It's like, man, I'm so bloated
Exactly.
all day.
So we tend to throw around things like addiction and depression a little loosely. So I think that it's fair to say that depression is wired into us as a possible state that we could all fall into, but that it's very important, in my opinion, that humans have tools to remove themselves from that state, of course, to avoid tragedies like suicide, but also because when the baseline on someone's life goes down far enough, they find it increasingly hard to do the sorts of things that are going to get them out of depression. So you or I could say...
So they stay in that state of depression because it's too hard to go work out. It's too hard to change my habit of eating healthier, so I'm going to stay... I'm going to keep eating ice cream, which is going to make my body, depressed.
That's right.
Right? If I keep eating bad foods, if I keep staying up till 4 a.m., if I keep staying in a toxic relationship, I'm going to feel depressed.
That's right. And eventually, because of this very inseparable relationship between the brain and body, eventually what happens is that because the brain controls the body, but also the body can control the brain, people lose the ability to intervene in this depressive process. So you or I could say, look, if someone who's depressed, what they need to do is get up early, get some light in their eyes, get some movement. I know you put this information out there, which I love, because those tips are grounded in, they're not even tips, they're really tools. And they're very powerful because they're grounded in excellent science. You get that dopamine release early in the day that's antidepressive. You time your sleep better when you get sun in your eyes, and you get movement early in the day. For most people, that's accessible, and they absolutely should be doing it. Everyone should be doing that. But for people who are far enough down that path of depression, because the body and the mind have this relationship that's so close, there is a crossover point where they really can't do those activities.
Because they're so far deep into depression?
The body won't do what they decide to do. And so, now I'm not trying to give anyone a pass, because ultimately we are all responsible for our own mental health. Certainly adults more than kids, but we're all responsible for our own mental health, and only we can direct our own brain changes. That's the stinger. Once we're 25 years and older, we are the only ones that can change our brain. And we can talk about neuroplasticity if you like, but the depressed person has to take responsibility for their behavior. But this is why it's so important to catch this brain-body relationship early and build routines that keep one out of depression.
For everything that happens to us from the time that we're born until the time we die, but that really boils down to only 5 things. The nervous system has the responsibility of sensation, so sensing the physical events in the environment. We have these so-called receptors in the eyes and the ears and the nose and the mouth, on the skin, that take physical entities in the universe that are real fixed, non-negotiable things like sound waves and photons of light and chemicals in the environment traveling that make it into our nose and things like that, and convert those into the second thing, which is perceptions. So the nervous system's responsibility is to take those sensations, which are non-negotiable, and perceive certain ones and not others. So for instance, right now, until I say, what's the sensation of your feet contacting the floor or the bottoms of your shoes, you weren't thinking about it, but those pressure receptors were being engaged the entire time. So your perception is like a window or a spotlight that's very much linked to attention. Then there are emotions, often called feelings. And those are really designed to push us down particular avenues of perception. And the next thing, which are thoughts. Okay, so we've got sensation, perception, feelings, and then there are thoughts, which really have a lot to do with what we're perceiving and the way we're organizing those perceptions, what they mean. And generally that's put into the context of what we already know, or memories. And then the 5th thing is behaviors or actions. And of course, neurons are responsible for generating actions, and there are really 2 kinds of actions. There are the actions that you generate reflexively, like your breathing and your heart rate right now are largely reflexive, or you could decide control of your respiration and make it voluntary, right? And not just reflexive. So those 5 things, sensations, perceptions, feelings, thoughts, and actions, really encompass all of our life experience. And that's from the very mundane of getting up in the morning and brushing your teeth to the most awe-inspiring, goal-motivated, pinnacle moments of your life. The nervous system, not the immune system, not the digestive system, all of which are important, but the nervous system, meaning the brain, spinal cord, and the connections with the body and the connections from the body back to the brain and spinal cord are responsible for all of that.
Everything that happens to you, your entire experience, I don't care what anyone says, I don't care what alignment the earth is in, everything is happening because your brain has these 3 jobs. And all of your experience is filtered through that thing in your head, that pile of cells that's arranged in a very specific way that we're still trying to understand, called your brain. Just like we could be talking about the heart, whose job is to pump blood. So I want to describe just how the brain works in 3 basic ways, 2 of which you've heard about before. We all have heard the lizard brain, the thing that freaks you out when you think there's someone standing in the corner and then you turn on the light and there's nobody, or if you were to come up on a car wreck and all of a sudden your heart's pumping. Your brain is very good at that stuff, and that's great. That's why you're alive at this moment. It is an unerring, unfailing system keeping you alive, your lizard brain, and it's generally designed to keep you alive and to scare you from doing things that would hurt you. And it's a shame, because I would have liked it to be generally good at making me feel good all the time. But that's generally not what it's good at. And I'm stealing from the great Tony Robbins, who says, there's paved roads to fear and misery and cobblestone or dirt roads to happiness. And that's true at the level of neuroanatomy. You don't have a whole lot of your brain devoted to happiness. You got a lot of your brain designed to keep you safe. So anxieties and fears come about a lot easier, and you need to combat those. We're all getting better at that. Thinking, planning, imagining, and doing is the other kind of end of the spectrum. I talked about that. And then there's the one that really counts, right? Which is this thing in the middle, which is the way that those things are connected. What do you think depends on how you feel. What you feel depends on how you think. We know this now. There's kind of common knowledge. And it's these maps of your experience. It depends on what happened to you and how you view the world. And we know this at a psychological level. Neuroscientists sometimes talk like this. They often don't. I'm in the minority. But there's a lot of neuroanatomy, there's a lot of powerful neuroscience to support this. What do I mean by your maps of experience? I mean, what happened to you shapes how you view the world. And so what's important is how you change how you view the world if you want to go forward beyond what would just how you were programmed, let's say.
It was me realizing I'm living in this squat. I've got a pet ferret. My girlfriend's gone. She broke up with me. She was smart enough to break up with me. I'm getting in fights. I'm working at a bagel shop. I'm barely making ends meet. And at that point, I just made the decision. I just said, okay, look, I'm not going to be a professional athlete. I think I'm pretty good at memorizing things. I think I have an interest in people. I'm going to just decide. I just decided to do school. I decided that was the track. So like some people pick the military because it's like if you know what to expect, at least in terms of the passages that you're going to go through. And for me, that was school. And so I had decided to get back in school. I moved into a studio apartment by myself. I quit partying completely. I didn't go to parties. I got really serious about fitness. So I just started running and lifting weights. And I studied.
You went like Henry Rollins style.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
That's a lot of self-awareness. I mean, people go into the military because on some level, some people do because there's some yearning for having that structure imposed upon their lives. But you constructed that kind of structure for yourself.
Yeah, I think I was really afraid. I think I was like, and these days, because my lab studies fear and I get into this whole thing around mindsets, people always ask me like, is it better to do something from a place of love or fear? Like, it depends. And at that point, fear was the best motivator for me. And I just basically worked like crazy. The brain is basically designed to be customized in the early part of life and then to implement those algorithms and that circuitry for the rest of its life. And so the brain can change in adulthood. And it can change provided that there's an emphasis on some perceptual event. So in other words, if you want to change your brain as an adult, let's say you want to be less anxious, you want to learn a new language, you want to be more functional in some way, presumably. The key thing is to bring focus to some particular perception of something that's happening during the learning process. And the reason for that is that there's a neurochemical system involving acetylcholine. And it comes from these 2 little nuclei down in the base of the brain called nucleus basalis. All day long, you're doing things in a reflexive way. But when you do something and you think about it very intensely, acetylcholine is released from basalis at the precise neurons that were involved in that behavior, and it marks those for change during sleep or during deep rest later. So for people that want to change their brain, the power of focus is really the entry point. And the ability to access deep rest and sleep. Because most people don't realize this, but neuroplasticity is triggered by intense focus. But neuroplasticity occurs during deep sleep and rest. One of the things that's really important also to think about how the brain works in terms of plasticity and all this stuff is what the brain really wants to do is also pass as much of what it does off to reflexive behavior as possible. So, so when we're talking about focus, I think it can get a little bit vague, but it might be useful to think about like what exactly is focus and what triggers plasticity. So the brain loves to be able to just do things, pick up coffee cups and drink and walk and talk and do things and not put much energy into it. When we decide to focus, what the brain really does is it switches on a set of circuits that involve the frontal cortex and nucleus basalis and some others, and it's trying to understand duration, how long something's going to last, path, what's going to happen, and outcome, what ultimately is going to happen. So duration, path, and outcome. You know, the events of early 2020 are a good example of this. One of the reasons why it's so exhausting to be alive in 2020 is because we are now having to pay attention to duration, path, and outcome. How long is this thing going to last? When are they going to open up all businesses? Did I touch that door handle? Does it matter?
Right.
Who are the experts? Are there any experts? There are a lot of questions, whereas normally we can just move through life without having to do all that analysis. So if it's a simple example like trying to learn a new language or a new motor skill or a new way of conceptualizing something, maybe somebody's in a therapeutic process and they're trying to work through a trauma or something like that, duration, path, and outcome is built into the networks of the brain. We can do that very easily, but it takes work. And it almost has a feeling of underlying agitation and frustration. And that's because the circuits that turn on before acetylcholine are of the stress system. So when you or I decide we're going to learn something and really dig in, norepinephrine, which is adrenaline, is secreted in the brainstem and in the body, and it brings about a state of alertness. Then our attention, which is mostly a diffuse light, is brought to a particular duration, path, and outcome analysis. This would be thinking about what somebody is saying. What are they really trying to say? A hard passage of reading, a hard set of math problems, a challenging physical workout. When you do that, these two systems have to work very hard, and the adult brain doesn't really want to change the algorithms it learned in childhood. But if you do those two things, you have alertness and focus. The acetylcholine and the norepinephrine converge to mark those synapses for change. And so the way to think about neuroplasticity, if one wants to change their brain, is bring about the most intense concentration you can to something, and then later bring about the least amount of concentration to that thing.
Forward movement, provided it doesn't endanger you or kill you, is absolutely the remedy for fear, stress, and at least in the clinical literature, to these sort of trauma events, that people carry with them for many years. Of course, trauma needs to be dealt with, hopefully with a professional, but we can all apply these mechanisms and these neurochemical reward schedules. So the study that you're referring to is a beautiful one. There's a classic study where researchers, not my lab, put two rats, or you could do this with mice, into a tube. And the tendency is for them to try and push one or the other one out. One always wins and pushes the other one out. We call the one that got pushed out the loser, the one that pushed them out the winner. Here are the interesting things about this. First of all, the winner will tend to win in other battles, even though these are just pushing battles, more because it simply won the time before. The loser, by losing, will tend to lose. And so people say, oh, well, that explains a lot about society, et cetera. Well, here's where it gets really interesting. You can even take a mouse or a rat and push it from behind and make it the winner. And then on subsequent trials where you're not pushing it, it will tend to win more often. So the win doesn't even have to come from itself. So last year, there was a very important paper published about this, where a set of researchers just said, well, what is it? Like, what is this winning circuit and this losing circuit? Enough with the demonstration that this happens. Like, what's happening what's under the hood? And so they went into the brain and they identified a brain area, which is part of the frontal cortex, the area that we typically think about planning, action, executive function, all the kind of high level stuff. And what they discovered was this brain area is more active in the winner than in the loser. In fact, they could take the loser and overstimulate this area and turn the losers into winners. Now, it gets even more ridiculous than that. If you quiet this brain area, winners become losers, okay? And if you take a winner and let's say at this tube battle, and you put them into, let's say, a cold environment with a bunch of other mice, and you have just a warm corner. Mice don't like to be cold. And you say, who gets the warm corner, right? Who gets the luxury spot? It's always the winner. So it even breaks down at the level of social interactions. And so you say, okay, all right, now we know that it's this brain area. It's this one area of the frontal cortex. But what's it actually doing, right? Okay, what's it actually, how can we translate this? Turns out this brain area that's responsible and required for winning in this series of experiments is actually driving up the level of activation, what you and I would call agitation or stress, to the point where that animal is more likely to move forward. It's simply taking stress, which is wired into us in order to make us feel agitated, instead of suppressing us, instead of saying, I'm just going to sit here, I'm overwhelmed, I'm not going to do it, I'm just going to move into action. So there's a circuit for winning. There's the same circuit when it's hypoactive, not active enough, is what causes losing in these competitive scenarios. And similarly, there's a circuit for quitting. There's a norepinephrine circuit in the brainstem. This was published in the last couple of years, showing that when animals or people are in constant effort, eventually that level of norepinephrine gets so high that it triggers a circuit that shuts down the motor control over the limbs, and you just say, that's it, I give up, I'm done. So these mechanisms were hardwired into us. We all have them. Whether or not it's from evolution, Mother Nature, God, the universe, it's irrelevant to the discussion that these circuits exist in everybody. And I think it's a select few people who really understand that forward action is what drives these circuits. It's the ability to take that agitation, stress, agitation, increase our focus, and they bias us for movement. And nature wanted that. They want us to move forward in the face of challenge, not to be quiescent. We weren't sitting around battling tigers and saber-toothed tigers all the time. More likely, we were in caves and we were getting hungry and we had to go out and search for things. Agitation and stress were designed to get us up and move us. And when we try and fight that too much and we try and quiet that stress, that actually can be problematic. You have to decide, are you going to try and quiet stress, or are you going to actually lean into action? That's a critical choice point for everybody who's experienced anything negative or positive for that matter.
The mind plays an important role in interpreting whether or not it's overwhelming or tolerable. So intense breathing like tumo breathing, or ice baths or cold showers, or intense exercise like high intensity interval training type stuff, teaches the mind to be comfortable in these higher stress states, where, in other words, it teaches people to be comfortable when they have a lot of adrenaline in their body. This is basically stress inoculation. But stress inoculation is not about not getting stressed. It's actually about divorcing the mind-body relationship a bit.
The nervous system is designed to orchestrate all the processes in the body, not just thinking and not just behavior. And really can be divided into 5 things. So there's sensation, and sensation is really bound or restricted by the receptors in the body. So receptors in the eye that perceive photons, light energy, receptors in the skin that perceive pressure, touch receptors, smell, taste, hearing, etc. And the interesting thing about sensation, and the fact that the nervous system needs to pay attention to sensation, is it's non-negotiable. The nervous system of humans is designed to extract physical phenomenon from the universe that are non-negotiable, photons of light. I can't see in the infrared with my eyes, and I can't see ultraviolet light with my eyes, and I can't perceive that because I don't have the receptors for it. So other animals can perceive some of those things, but that leads us to the next thing, which is perception, which is which sensations are you paying attention to? So all the time you're sensing things. Like right now, your feet are sensing the contact with your shoes, but you're not thinking about it until I say that. And then you shift your perception. Right. So perception is like this spotlight. So the brain wants to constantly bring in sensation. It's non-negotiable what's coming in. It's just dependent on your environment. Perception is negotiable. You can control that, because I just said shoes and you thought about your feet, and there you are. Then there are feelings, which can be a little bit nebulous, but feelings are a link between our emotion, and it generally invokes the body, sensations in the body and concepts in the mind of what those sensations are about. That's really what emotions are. Animals definitely experience them. I'm kind of appalled to think that 10 years ago, people were like, do animals have emotions? Of course they have emotions, right? Because those are bodily sensations merged with some perception. So of course they do. And then there's thoughts. And thoughts are interesting because thoughts happen spontaneously. Think about like a web browser that's constantly giving you pop-ups. But thoughts can also be deliberate. So you and I can decide right now that we're going to think about a plan for something. or we're going to think about what's going on in the world. So thoughts happen spontaneously and they can be deliberate. And then the final thing is behaviors and action. So the nervous system is responsible for sensation, perception, feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. And what's interesting, you start to think about that as you're like, okay, that's a lot. But what is the nervous system really trying to accomplish? Like on any given day or at any moment, what's it trying to accomplish? And it's really trying to accomplish one thing, which is to take perceptions of the outside world and merge those with perceptions of the inside world, what we call interoception, and to link those in a way that's operating on our environment in the appropriate way. So what do I mean by that? So if I'm feeling anxious and I'm in a very calm environment, I'm going to perceive that rapid heart rate and kind of feeling of agitation in my body as inappropriate for the moment, right? And my goal then as an organism is to adjust my level of what they call autonomic arousal or alertness down. If I'm at a great party, or I'm at a wedding, or it's a celebration, or I'm at a protest, or then I might feel that my level of alertness is appropriate for my environment. So the nervous system is in this constant dynamic interaction with the outside world and trying to figure that out. One way that this can be kind of conceptualized is there's an emerging idea that's kind of interesting about impatience. So we've all had the feeling of being impatient. Some people are far more patient than others. But if you've ever been in line at the store and you feel like something's going very slowly, the person in front of you is taking a long time, they're doing some returns, and you're getting kind of impatient, maybe you're breathing in a mask, and you're like, what's the idea is that if you're getting a certain frequency of pulses from your body, and if those pulses are coming in quickly, like you're perceiving yourself, that interoception quickly, it's like pulse, 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 pulse. You're going to be more geared towards your internal representation. And then you're seeing what's going on in the outside world, and it seems like it's going very slowly. But there are other times when you're in line at the store, someone's getting some returns and you're texting on your phone, or you've had a great day, you've had a great run, your family's in great shape, and you're fine. Why? Well, the frequency of those pulses, that interoception, is matched pretty well to your outside environment. And so impatience is really when your internal sort of metronome, tick, 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 is not matched well to the external environment. There are other times when you're feeling like your internal metronome is tick, 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 and you've got a million things coming at you through email or text, and you've got a bunch of things, and you're feeling overwhelmed and tired. Well, in either case, there's nothing right or wrong. It's just your body and your brain are trying to say, what's going on in the outside world and how well matched am I to it?
Right.
So if you think about some of the sort of core practices of mindfulness and self-regulation, of like focusing on breathing or focusing on state of mind, a lot of that is trying to bring more awareness to your internal state. But what our brain is normally doing when our eyes are open and we're interacting in the world is we're constantly trying to update our internal state to match external demands of the world. And this harkens back to a really early design of all nervous systems, which is how do you take an organism that needs certain things, food, water, mates, reproduction, shelter, how do you move that organism? How do you create a system that will do that in best relation to the environment? And so what Mother Nature has done is designed a series of systems. Let's just take agitation and stress for one. If an animal or a human is very thirsty, you feel kind of agitated, you might get up and get a drink of water. If you're very thirsty, it can put you into a state of panic. If you're extremely thirsty and water is a limited resource, you might even resort to violence to get it, or negotiation of some sort that you wouldn't if you were calmer. So the stress and agitation were designed to actually mobilize the body to take us in the direction of something that's adaptive. So you can start to see these kind of core elements of what the brain and nervous system do: sensation, perception, feeling, thought, and action. And this constant challenge of trying to match our internal state to the external real estate, the outside world. And you start to see that the sensations that we call stress or impatience or calm are really the result of those attempts that the nervous system is trying to perform.
This is what you've done. This is what people from elite special forces can do. They know how to make small, simple, physical steps in the real world that allow them to build on these reward circuitries, but they don't get delusional about how they're doing. They know, they keep the end in mind, but they get very micro. They move the horizon in very close. And so if you can move the horizon to something you know you can complete and you reward that, you essentially are where you were before. You're just as strong, if not stronger, but you're heading in the direction you need to go. You're not depleting. You're not spending out anything. And it feels a little weird because none of us like to reward things that aren't external.
To what extent does our subjective narrative,
the story we tell ourselves,
actually mean something for the body? And to what extent does the body actually mean something for the subjective narrative? So this gets into some areas of work that we're doing now. And so I do want to highlight that it's ongoing work. But I think, the old narrative, meaning 10 years ago, was that if you're feeling depressed, just smile. The reason I call it a brain-body contract early on is that the brain and the body are constantly in dialogue. So, the idea that when we're depressed, we tend to be in more defensive type postures. When we're feeling good, we tend to be in more like relaxed and extended postures. All true. But it does not mean that just by occupying the extended posture that I'm going to completely shift the mind.
Right.
That's a first step. Think about like two interlocking gears. It's one gear that turns the other, but then they need to kind of dance together before you can get the whole system going.
So how do you get it to dance together?
Exactly. So there is one way in which subjective thought and deliberate thought is very powerful over states of mind and body. To answer your question, can you think your way out of the ice bath being cold? So a couple things that are important. First of all, just to go a little deeper on what thoughts are. Thoughts happen spontaneously all the time. Mm-hmm. They're popping up like a poorly filtered internet connection. But thoughts can also be deliberately introduced. For instance, right now, I can say, okay, have a thought that just decide to write your name. And you can do that. I'm going to decide to write my name, and you can do it. So that's a deliberate thought, which says that you can introduce thoughts. So I think it's very hard to control negative thoughts directly by trying to suppress them. Generally, they tend to just want to continue to geyser up all the time. But we can introduce a positive thought.
An ability to control your levels of stress in real time is extremely powerful. It turns out you can do this using physiology and neuroscience. Your breathing can directly impact your heart rate and your level of stress or calm. Here's how it works. When you inhale, your diaphragm moves down. This creates more space in your thoracic cavity, and your heart actually gets a little bit bigger. As a consequence, the rate of blood flow through that larger heart volume slows down. A signal is sent from a group of neurons on your heart called the sinoatrial node. That signal goes up to the brain, and your brain sends a signal to speed the heart up. In other words, inhaling speeds your heart rate up. The opposite is true as well. When you exhale, your diaphragm moves up. Your heart gets a little bit smaller because there's a little bit less space in your thoracic cavity. As a consequence, blood flows more quickly through that smaller volume. The sinoatrial node registers that and sends a signal to your brain, and the brain sends a signal to slow the heart down. So in other words, inhaling speeds your heart rate up. Exhaling slows your heart rate down. So if you want to speed up your heart rate and be more alert, inhale more or make those inhales more vigorous, more intense. If you want to calm down, you can do that quickly by making your exhales slightly longer than your inhales or making them more vigorous. This doesn't require any breath work. This is something that you can do in real time. And that's what's called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. That's the technical phrase. It's also the basis of what's called heart rate variability, or HRV. But all you need to remember is inhaling deeper and longer will speed your heart rate up. Exhaling longer and more intensely will slow your heart rate down and will allow you to calm down in real time.
Acetylcholine is the neurochemical that we want to think about anytime we're talking about neural plasticity, and in particular, attention, high attentional states. So everyone knows that the brain is very plastic early in life. So from birth until about age 25, you can learn so much, for better or for worse. I always say the downside is that early in life, you have less control over your life circumstances, but your brain is very plastic. So there's a dark and light to that. Later in life, you have a lot more control generally over your life circumstances, but the brain becomes less plastic. However, we know, based on Nobel Prize winning work and recent work in addition to that, that the neuromodulator, acetylcholine, is secreted when we pay attention to something very specific. It acts as sort of a spotlight in the brain, making certain synapses, the connections between neurons, more active and more likely to be active again than others. So when you hear that song that you love so much and it moves you and you feel dopamine being pulsed into your body, that's a real thing. You're actually getting dopamine secretion. You've formed that deep association with that. And acetylcholine draws your attention to that. And that song is essentially wired in a very indelible way into your nervous system at multiple. You can probably, even with certain songs, you can feel your body start to energize because, of course, the brain, through connections with your muscles, controls your body. So for things that are traumatic or negative, what we're really talking about is neuroplasticity that's focused on unlearning. And most of the therapies for this, whether or not it's EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, or it's traditional psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, or it's somatic embodied release, big, Kundalini breathing type, almost all of those are designed to do something, which is to bring the person, or you bring yourself, into a state of heightened alertness, right? You can't do this stuff when you're sort of half asleep. Heightened alertness, and then focusing your attention on the traumatic or negative event. This is the way that it works. And then pairing that with something new. Traditionally, this was done with things like NLP or in talk therapy, where people would feel the positive relationship with the therapist. That was kind of the main rationale in association with this very traumatic, sometimes even, shameful type events. And the idea is that you would simultaneously have those two experiences, the negative one and the feeling of safety, and you would rewire those circuitries. I actually believe that can work, but it can take a lot of times. It can take a lot of visits to the therapist, which is not to say it's bad. It's just not everyone has access to those resources. Things like eye movement desensitization reprocessing, simply moving the eyes laterally while recounting these negative events. The woman who devised this figured out that somehow when people recount these traumatic experiences, when they're doing these lateralized eye movements, not vertical eye movements, they somehow separate out the negative emotions. And I thought for years, people would ask me about this stuff, Tom, and I thought, this is ridiculous. First of all, I'm a vision scientist and I work on stress. It's like, there's no way. And then I really ate my words, because 4 papers, 2 in humans, 2 in mice, and then a 5th paper published in Nature, which is kind of our Super Bowl of scientific publishing, showed that these lateralized eye movements quiet the amygdala. They actually suppress activation of this threat detection center in the amygdala. And
why would that be true?
So this is really where it gets cool. Turns out, because of when the way that we view the visual world when we move through space, when our head moves or when we walk and things flow past us, that these lateralized eye movements are what happens when you move forward in space, when you're walking, when you're moving forward towards something. And that suppresses activation of the amygdala. Now you say, why? Well, okay, so then 2018, my laboratory did an experiment. There was actually a graduate student in my laboratory where we're looking at fear. In this case, we were looking at fear to big looming objects that either trigger freezing or running and hiding. There's a brain area that's in your brain and my brain that mice also have that triggers a third option, not run and hide, not freeze, but forward confrontation. This is the, no, I'm going to fight. I'm going to move forward in the face of adversity. This is the growth mindset. I'm going to lean into friction. And it turns out that this circuit is linked to the dopamine reward pathway. When we move forward in the face of a threat, and obviously we want to do this in healthy, adaptive ways, we suppress activity of the amygdala through physical action of moving forward, and there's a signal sent to the areas of the brain that control dopamine reward. Those reward centers then trigger the release of dopamine to reward forward effort in the face of stress or threat. So when you hear about people saying, look, take some physical action when you're feeling exhausted. Take some forward physical action when you're feeling overwhelmed by this traumatic experience. Now, that could be in the form of a walk. Now, this therapist, she figured out with EMDR, because you can't take people walking around for therapy sessions, she figured out that these lateralized eye movements are what triggers suppression of the amygdala. And it makes perfect sense, because the amygdala, this threat detection center in our brain, it doesn't connect to the limbs. So how does it know if you're moving forward? Well, because the eyes are moving. You have these reflexive eye movements that move anytime you're moving through space. So to make this a little more succinct, it's really forward movement, action, pushing yourself across that threshold, not only rewards you, but it suppresses activity of the fear centers in the brain. And these are ancient hardwired mechanisms. These aren't hacks. These are things that Mother Nature installed in us.
I'm a big fan of wellness, and I think it's a great community, but it tends to run in absolutes, and there aren't a lot of operational definitions, as we say in science. And what I love about your questions, you're asking for really getting to the meat of things, asking for the operational definitions. One of the most dangerous ideas in wellness and in popular psychology is that your body hears every thought you have. What a terrible thing to put on people. You know, what a challenging thing. I don't think people should try and suppress their negative thoughts. I think there is great value, however, to introducing positive thought schemes. Now, the reason is not because I think it's just because I think so, but because there's actually a neurochemical basis for controlling stress and actually making stress more tolerable and extending one's ability to be in bouts of effort. And that relates to the dopamine pathway. So the molecule dopamine is a reward. It's released in the brain when you win a game, you close a deal, you meet the love of your life, someone likes your photo, the great love of your life, you complete something. But most of our dopamine release is not from achieving goals. It's actually released when we are en route to our goals, when we're in pursuit of our goals, and we think we're on the right path.
Is one meditation, very short, 5 minutes, where for one breath, you close your eyes and go internal, and you get behind, and some people call it the third eye, right? I'm gonna get the language wrong, but we all know what we're talking about. You get inside your breath. And then the second thing you do is you focus on something at a short distance. There's a powerful system in your brain when you focus both eyes on a single point, like a watchmaker making a watch, or you're reading. That state is accessing very specific channels in your brain that are very different from the one that when you close your eyes, okay? And it's called a vergence eye movement when you put both your eyes on the same thing. And then the last one is the one that we get a lot of here, that feeling, awesome feeling when you go out to the beach or you're on the top of a mountain or you look at the horizon or you arrive in New York City if you're me and you just go, oh my God, and you're defocused. And that's when these ideas, the creativity kind of spontaneously geysers up from below. But then you have to get back and you need to get to work on something. And so what's been very powerful, and we're putting patients through this, or subjects in brain imaging, is this way of accessing all these different brain states is really about accessing different notions of space and time, trying to get access to your whole brain. And it's a short meditation. I recommend just one breath at each of these kind of stations, in your mind, up close and focusing on your hand, and out. And I'll repeat that a few times during my morning, or maybe once or twice during the day. It's quick, and we're getting remarkable feedback from the people that are doing this about the kind of state that it puts them in, both engaged and present with the bigger picture. And in the end, it's all about the bigger picture, right? Because it's about not just what you do with your life, but how you're gonna create good in the world.
Bring as much focus to a behavior or to a thought or to an action pattern. And there has to be a sense of urgency. So what Knudsen lab showed, and another lab at UCSF, Mike Merzenich's lab showed, is that if there's a serious contingency, like in order to get your ration of food each day, you have to learn this thing, the degree of plasticity is remarkable.
Right.
But if there isn't an incentive, it just isn't gonna happen. So these circuits in the brain that Mother Nature set up are designed to be anchored to a real need. And people always say to me, well, should I do something out of love and a real desire to learn, or should it be out of fear? But either one works. The sense of urgency is just acetylcholine. It's norepinephrine. That's all it is. The brain doesn't have a recognition of whether or not something is pleasurable or not until later. Once you start accomplishing your goal, the reward systems like dopamine start kicking in. But I think if people are interested in modifying their brain for the better, at least some, top contour understanding of how urgency and focus must converge for that to happen can be useful, because I think there's a lot of attention paid to whether or not something feels like flow, or whether or not it's what I call highly desirable states, or whether or not you can eat a plant out of the ground that will magically put your brain into a state of plasticity. And the answer is yes, such plants exist, but what's missing is the focus component. If that work is not done with a particular end goal in mind, you'll get plasticity, but you'll get plasticity in a kind of across the board. It's like learning a little bit of 9 languages all at once is not gonna make you speak coherently in any one of them. So focus is the key.
Because you made it this far in a video, I want to celebrate you. Most people start and don't finish. Most people never actually follow through. Most people say they want something, but they don't ever do the work to actually get it. But you're different. you are special. Believe Nation, you made it here all the way to the end, and I love you. So as a special celebration, if you put a hashtag believe down in the comments below on this video, I will showcase you and celebrate you somewhere on the screen in a future video because you are awesome. For 10 more amazing rules from Ethan Kross, check out the video right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
Pain is useful in small doses. It's really helpful that if I put my hand on the flame, I pull it away.
Talking excessively about what's happening in our head can have negative